everyone. My name is Shifat Ara, and I'm the project manager for Diversity Work. Welcome to the final part of the two-part webinar series on the why behind the how, broadening diversity discussions and becoming liberated. I am hosting this event on behalf of CASE. CASE stands for Canadian Association for Supported Employment. CASE is a national network focused on supporting our member organizations to increase employment inclusion for Canadian citizens who experience a disability. We are offering 2 additional services to help you participate in this webinar. Our sign language interpreters, Vanessa and Amina, will appear in a video window as part of the speaker panel. Thank you for your support today, Vanessa and Amina. Live closed captioning will be available. On your control panel, click the closed captioning button and select Show Subtitle to turn on this feature. This webinar will be recorded. We request you to keep your cameras turned off and microphones muted. If you have a question, please click on the chat box at the bottom of your screen and type it there. We have set aside time to address many of your questions later in the webinar. However, feel free to add them at any point during the presentation. Today's session will be led by Winnie Grant. Winnie has spent the last 30 years exploring the impact of racial trauma and the intersectionality of various forms of oppression in one's private and professional life. She employs an Afrocentric theoretical perspective and critical race analysis in her work. And with that, I now hand over to Winnie.
Thank you for that introduction. And again, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar today. I would like to start by doing a land acknowledgement. And so as we come together today, we do so acknowledging that we are privileged to be on the traditional land of Turtle Island in North America. I am presenting from my home in Mi'kma'ki, and Mi'kma'ki is located in Nova Scotia, which is the unceded and ancestral home of the Mi'kmaq people. As community members, we are guided by a spirit of welcome and connection to this land and its people. I walk and practice in the spirit of my African Nova Scotian ancestors who have come before me and honor the legacy of brilliance and resilience, firmly rooted in over 400 years of historical and soulful presence. I am thankful to those that have gone on before us and those who remain among us. And I invite you to join this event today in that spirit of stewardship and respect, as well as gratitude for the weather we are experiencing today. So as was mentioned, the title of today's session and the actual workshop, so today's session is the how in front of the why, whereas the first part was the why that was behind the how. And so I coined it that way simply because oftentimes doing this work, folks would ask, how do I become more inclusive? How do I get a checklist or a checkbox to do the work of diversity and inclusion? And today we're speaking specifically about those individuals who identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color living with a disability. And so today we will focus on the how that's in front of the why, and again, broadening the discussions around diversity and becoming liberated. So I would like to start by just going over the agenda for today. So again, welcome. I'd like to do a brief recap of part 1 for those who were not able to join us for part 1, and then move into focusing on the how. So looking at decolonization, understanding the connection between decolonizing, Afrocentricity, and intersectionality. There will be a couple of videos that will help to set the context and to just reinforce some of the information that we will talk about. And then we'll move into the way forward, supporting Black, Indigenous, and persons of color living with a disability through understanding the connections between the practice of decolonization, Afrocentricity, and intersectionality. And we will conclude with a call to action and liberation, and hoping that throughout this process, you will have many questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions, but hopefully we'll be able to engage in a conversation that will help all of us to work collaboratively as we begin to equalize the opportunities for all. So a recap of part one. We started off by talking about the who and the why. And so again, the individuals or the population that we're talking about today are persons who identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color living with a disability. We also talked about why. And so we'll go through the some of the whys in which we talked about. So we talked about individuals who have multiple identities. And so we determined that all of us have multiple identities. And we talked about the Euro-Western supremacy in terms of how society is structured and how those multiple identities oftentimes interplay with each other, and how folks are not only oppressed because of the fact that they identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, but they also are oppressed because of many other identities that they subscribe to. And that could be their social location in terms of sexual orientation, ableism, in terms of their socioeconomic background, their sexual orientation or status. And so we also went through looking at what are some of those social barriers that continue to oppress individuals. And so last week we talked about prejudice, and we defined prejudice as the preconceived thought that individuals have, and determined that all of us hold prejudicial thoughts. We also talked about discrimination, and again defined discrimination as the action that is behind the preconceived thoughts. And we talked about the fact that discrimination happens on an individual basis, on a larger scale, but we also determined last week that all of us can discriminate against each other. We talked about stereotypes and defined it as a characteristic that is associated with a group of people. And we talked about the fact that stereotypes are perpetuated as a result of living in a Eurocentric society where the structures are identified to privilege some and not others. We talked about racism, and we defined racism as the oppression of a race of people. We talked about the structures, the intersecting of those structures and oppression, and how it oppresses specific populations. And we have identified last week that those individuals who identify as racialized are not able to oppress another group. Therefore, we identified that individuals who are of Eurocentric background are those who are who can be racist, who continue to perpetuate racism. And we talked about trauma. And we talked about trauma in relation to the events that happen that are not controlled by the individuals. And we're talking any form of trauma. But when we talk about racialized trauma, we identified racism as a form of trauma that the individual is not able to control. And therefore, we also talked about the multiple impacts that trauma has, racialized trauma has, on this particular population that we are addressing today. And for those who may not have been at the first session, if there are questions that you have regarding any of these terms, I encourage you to put those in the chat so that we can have a further discussion later. So this is a chart that I created to help folks to understand just a little better the intersectionalities of the oppressions that individuals with specific identities. And so again, if you are racialized, your oppression would be racism. If you consider yourself to be a senior, it could be age. It could be also around your sexual orientation, marital status, your religion, your culture, your ability. And what we determined is that because of the various forms of oppression that's identified there, any one of those forms of oppression can be oppressed by any of those institutions that's in red. And so what we've determined is that through the interfacing of any of these institutions and recognizing that in a given day, an individual may interact with any one of these institutions. Therefore, they would have compounding oppressions and compounding experiences of trauma. Also, as you look into the third column, which talks about the psychological impact, that any one of these psychological impacts could be the result of interfacing with one of the institutions, and again, as a result of any one of the oppressions that have been identified. And so when we spoke last time, we talked about, or we heard from an individual by the name of Carrie Gray, who talked about her disability, talked about the many identities that she subscribes to, and also how the work that she's doing around social justice indicates that it is her mission to ensure that nobody is left behind. And so I use these two posters just as an example to show how when we talk about International Day of People with Disability, which is on the right, it appears that the individuals in that poster who are depicted with various levels of disabilities do not necessarily reflect racialized populations. And so you see on the left that there is a poster that talks about Disabled People of Color Day. And so it raises a question for me in terms of what is the message that this provides to the population of individuals who are living with a disability, who may not be feeling welcomed into the discussion around disability. It also raises a question for me as to how and why we need to have this discussion specifically around individuals who identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And so the aim is to, how do we work collaboratively so that we have an inclusive and diverse, and so that we are not, again, subscribing to Eurocentric ideologies where we are now separating individuals based on racialization. And so I'll ask Albert if he would put up the video, and this will help to reinforce some of the discussions that we just talked about around intersectionality and persons living with a disability.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance, sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
Thank you, Albert, for sharing that with us. So as you can see, when we're talking about intersectionality, it talks about the centering. And so as we continue to move forward, the way forward is through understanding the connections between the practice of decolonization, Afrocentricity, and intersectionality. And so beginning for this segment of our webinar, we'll start to look at the how. And so starting with decolonization, decolonization seeks to disrupt practices, standards, and expectations in nations that have been dominated by Eurocentric ideologies. In Canada, we are still serving the British monarch and operate under an Eurocentric model that favors the descendant of such colonization. Colonization of Turtle Island through the lens of European settlers has led to the development and maintenance of system issues and barriers that continue to plague those individuals who identify as Black, Indigenous, and persons of color in this country. So decolonization works to ensure that the systems under which we live and build our lives are reflective of our values and ideals in a collective manner. The goal is to deconstruct the colonized systems that exist to reduce the mass scale of harm that consistently and negatively impact the lives of those individuals who identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. So the other framework is Afrocentricity. And Afrocentricity differs from a Eurocentric Western ideology by centering individuals as the subject and not the object of their experiences. An Afrocentric approach reflects a human-centered approach, collective community strategies, holistic view of personhood, spiritual connections, liberation, and is a form of decolonization. And some basic principles based on an Afrocentric ideology is that it centers the experiences of individuals as representatives of their own liberation. It emphasizes harmony, collectivity, non-materialistic qualities. It eliminates the negative narratives about individuals subject by legitimizing traditional worldviews. Afrocentricity understands the holistic concept of people. It fosters and develops a collective sense of consciousness. And it analyzes the context and systemic structural realities of the individuals that we're working with. So implementing Afrocentricity and decolonization utilizes a human-centered approach, which is key in the beginning to fully support individuals who have intersecting identities. And really what this means is that we need to meet people where they are, regardless of the cost. And if we are committed to do this work, then cost is not the driving force. It is really about the uniqueness, the diversity, and the sense of belonging that we want to create for this population. We want to move away from a one-size-fits-all mentality, that people are worth the time and investment that it will take to meet their unique needs. We want to train and educate ourselves and our teams on systemic barriers that exist to ensure their understanding of the why change is required and who is being excluded. We want to recognize the talent of non-dominant groups at all levels of our organization. And we want to start to think about whose voice is missing from the table. We want to make space for healing and connectedness in the workplace. And this can take the form of a healing session or sessions for specific marginalized groups. It could be incorporating a book club in your organization or creating a standing day for conversations and connection. Whatever it is, we need to make time to connect intentionally through providing a safe space for individuals to voluntarily share if they feel that they want to share, and put in place mechanisms for those who decide that they want to share to ensure that they're being heard. So the benefits of utilizing decolonization, Afrocentricity, intersectionality in the workplace. And the benefits are not only just for the employees that are reflective of our BIPOC persons living with a disability, but it also could benefit all of the staff. And so employees will feel valued when they feel that they are included, understood, and valued in their workplaces. Employees will stay longer in an environment where they feel safe and supported, and this helps with the retention of employees. And it also creates an opportunity for employees to be the champion of your organization as well, and creates an environment where others will want to work with your organization. Employees will be able to be more productive when they are not distracted by the lack of support that they receive. Employees will experience less mental health related stress once their needs and identity or identities are supported, which equates to less sick days and a better office environment for folks to coexist and thrive. And these approaches will attract a more diverse range of people with varying lens and experiences that will lead to the development of a healthy and inclusive work environment. So what are the common themes between decolonization, Afrocentricity, and intersectionality. And so one of the primary themes is that it disrupts the norms of Eurocentric ideologies. It calls out privilege, it calls out oppression, and it centers the experience of the individual in the work that we do. It increases one's level of consciousness. It promotes self-determination. It also promotes empowerment. And it helps to develop an analysis that takes into consideration the systemic and structural realities of the individuals that we are trying to serve. And so I have another short video that I'll ask Albert to play. And this video talks about diversity and being able to manage diversity in the workplace.
So managing workplace relationships is really about managing diversity. That's quite contradictory in some respects because we are all diverse. Nobody's the same as me. We're not the same as each other. But unlike outside in our real lives where we don't have to talk to a neighbour if we don't want to, or we don't have to say hello to someone as they come down the street, within a workplace context, we're actually all thrown together. And it's that throwing together that we have to find a way of navigating. And for most of the time, it doesn't matter. Most of the time, people rub along quite well together. But when we bring ourselves to work, we're not just bringing us. We often bring our religions, we bring our culture. For some of us, we can't help but bring the way we look, our colour, our identity. So all of those things become part of workplace culture. The challenge around that is when our values actually butt against one another in the context of the workplace environment. And often our ability to manage that is actually quite challenged by what we know of how we are supposed to act and be together within work. So to simplify that, we're often told that it's good to have diversity, it's good to have different cultures coming together. What we don't seem to be able to understand is where our own personal values and beliefs stop and the contract that we have to deliver our work begins. And it's that edge that managers often find difficult. So should I be accepting of people's values and beliefs and cultures? Yes. The degree to which I should be accepting of that in the context of the work we've got to be delivered, less clear to me. And it's that fuzziness that we help people to actually understand in the managing workplace program, really. And it helps managers to be more efficient about how they understand those challenges. It gives them some guidance, really, some real practical tools about how they can actually support people who are part of their team to perform better, but also to perform well together in pursuit of an objective, and the degree to which those values come into the workplace and stay out.
So the next portion is the call to action and liberation. And so what might that look like? I have some suggestions, but again, they are not exhaustive. And I encourage folks to consider these suggestions, consider what it is that you are doing in your agencies, and also to look at how we may even advance the work that we're doing at another level, at a higher level. And so from a personal, we need to decolonize our minds. We need to accept that white supremacy and institutional racism are real. We need to interrogate the dominant narrative, understand implicit bias and your role in supporting and perpetuating structural racism. We need to complete our own internal work. So this means not putting the burden exclusively on individuals that identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, or other non-racialized people who you perceive to be doing the work or who you feel might be woke to explain the system to you. It's important that you hold yourself accountable and do your own work. Interpersonally, it's important that you respect the lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color living with or without a disability operating within white dominant culture. Commitment is important to building and being vulnerable to and learning through relationships with people of different races, especially people of color whose voices are often marginalized. And when we talk about being vulnerable and learning, I'm not talking about expecting people of color to educate you, that as was indicated in the previous slide, that it is important that you do your own work and not to exploit the knowledge of this population. And again, it's important to acknowledge the impact of race-based power differentials within your organization and other organizations that you interact with. From an institutional perspective, it's important that you make the commitment to understand and speak publicly on principles of race equity and how they apply in the institutional context. To disaggregate staff engagement, performance, compensation, and promotion retention data by race at all staff levels. And again, hold yourself and your leadership accountable to do this work. It's also important to engage staff and communities of color to inform governance, decision-making, and execution across organizational processes. And again, when we're talking about engaging, we're not talking about exploiting, we're talking about compensating. If we are engaging and consulting with communities of color, then we need to value their time and provide compensation. And it's not just sort of a one-sided coin. We need to make sure that if we don't have anybody internally in our office that can provide the support in addition to the consultation, that we really need to look at our staff composition and how do we promote, recruit, so that we have a diverse staff. And having a diverse staff will augment the community consultation results that we will gain. And so structurally, it's important that we are accountable at the individual and organizational level for dismantling personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural instruments of white supremacy. And so what might that look like? What might your organization have to put in place in order to attain this? Publicity or advocate for race equity and challenge white dominant cultural norms, including naming microaggressions in interpersonal and institutional contexts, and cede power to people of color within and across teams, organizations, and systems. And so in order to do that, we need to look at how we can support each other and become an ally in this work that we're proposing to do and that is necessary to do. So we need to understand our privilege, we need to amplify our voice, and we also need to amplify the voice of those persons who identify as Black, Indigenous, or person of color that are living with a disability. We have to continuously hold ourselves accountable. We need to understand the impact, not just of society, but of our own actions. How are we perpetuating racism, stereotypes? How are we discriminating? Are we conscious of our preconceived thoughts? Do we understand intersectionality? And if so, how do we focus on the intersectionality of the individuals that we are supporting as a job search? And are we open to corrective action? Do we believe that because our intention was not to harm, that we do not need to be corrected? And do we take offense when we are corrected? And so to stay engaged in this work is critically important because oftentimes there's a choice. You can choose to continue to engage in disrupting the status quo, or when it becomes uncomfortable and you experience this level of discomfort, you have the option to pause. And unlike racialized individuals, they don't have the option to pause. In order to stay, of course, in this work, we need to expect and accept non-closure. So recognizing that when we are doing this work, we need patience because it doesn't happen overnight, but also there may be pieces of the work that we're doing that we want to see an end to, and it takes time. As we identify and witness various acts of racism and discrimination, we need to be able to share that truth with members of our organization. It could be our peers. It could, you could seek support outside of your organization as a coaching opportunity to support you, but you need to find the ability and the capacity to share this information if you are committed to making an organizational change, so that, again, the individuals that we're providing the support to feel the results on the other end. And so as a service provider, there are a number of things that you can do as you assist job seekers. So being proactive, you can assist employers in modifying their policies. If you are observing or witnessing that the policy is not inclusive, you can provide information and or workshops to adjust the mindset and workplace culture so that it is more inclusive. You can provide employers with information about consultants who specialize in creating inclusive spaces. You can foster appropriate relationships with job seekers and potential employers. You can advocate to improve workplace design and accessibility. And oftentimes when we are out there recruiting and speaking to employers, they're not fully aware of all of the needs that should happen to have an inclusive and welcoming work environment. And so it's important that we approach this from that perspective and that we're there to provide them with the necessary support that they require. To support BIPOC job seekers, it's important that we understand the realities of their experiences with racial discrimination. It's important also that we utilize non-traditional recruitment strategies that may require you to advertise or to seek out other organizations that are inclusive or going directly into various communities. Again, to offer multiple modes of accessibility, and that can reflect offering accessible transportation, investing in accessible technology, and recognizing the multiple uniqueness of individuals and what their needs may be, and providing ways to be creative to support them. Again, create opportunities for individuals to be reflective in your workplace, and it can look like ensuring diverse and inclusive hiring committees so that when we are interviewing, we are inclusive and we are addressing some of the barriers, the social barriers that individuals from this population experience as they are seeking employment. We can also create opportunities for individuals who have already worked within your organization to share what barriers or areas where more support can be developed. And so not to be afraid of the gaps that already exist. And if we are truly being intentional, we are looking to be better, and therefore we want to be able to have individuals share the truth. And again, we can become creative and go beyond traditional forms of access. And so we do not need to be restricted in order to accommodate individuals. And so we can be innovative. The importance of engaging in self-directed learning to assist you in meaningful conversations with job seekers. And when we talk about self-directed learning, and that could vary based on the individuals that you are supporting, but also the multiple barriers that exist. And it's your responsibility, as we talked earlier, to become aware of what that looks like for each individual who is providing support to job seekers, but it's also recognizing that you're accountable and responsible for your own learning so that you can be effective in the work that you're doing. And celebrate the uniqueness of each job seeker and champion the same with potential employers. And so when we are looking at doing this work from an Afrocentric or decolonizing or intersectionality, we want to make sure if we're truly upholding the uniqueness of the individual, that we are identifying them as the subject. And so we want to make sure that we are able to not only empower them to be proud of the skills and their abilities that they have, but we truly need to believe in that as well if we are there working on their behalf and reaching into potential employers. And so another is creating a safe space. And how do we do that? How do we create a safe space for the diversity which is within our organization? And so before we can start, we need to know what the diversities are within our organization and work intentionally to disrupt any oppression that is existing. So we need to discourage ableist language and remove physical barriers and be proactive about accessibility. We need to support flexible work hours and remote working opportunities. Support employees to control the terms of their own confidentiality and or disclose with other staff. Implement ongoing training opportunities for staff to learn how to appropriately support individuals living with disabilities in the workplace. And again, consult with individuals who specialize in creating inclusive spaces for individuals living with disabilities. And so when we talk about creating a safe space, there will be several reiterations of what that might look like. It could also include having signs that are in your workplace that indicates that racist language is not tolerated in this work environment. It could also provide opportunities for individuals to take a leadership role. But we also want to make sure that when we're talking about creating a safe space, that we don't think that it's a one and done, that it's a continuous learning opportunity for all of us, and the importance of staying current and constantly checking ourselves in terms of how we may perpetuate racism and ableist language. And so a possible solution that I've identified is gaining a deeper understanding from a personal and organizational perspective by assessing the needs through the development of a strategic plan for your organization. A strategic plan can insist in being intentional from senior management level and across your organization about the commitment you are making to the population of BIPOC-D. And so when we talk about intentionality and we're talking about doing this work, it is important that this work is led by leadership and the commitment is demonstrated through leadership, through your board, and holding others within your organization accountable. So thank you for your time today. I do have a few questions, and I'm hoping that there are a few questions in the chat. And they don't have to be questions. If there are things that your organization is doing that you would like to share, please feel free to do the same. But a couple of questions that I have is, how will you increase your knowledge about the intersection of oppressions faced by BIPOC-D population? And if you, again, if you feel that I'm not sure, is there a question that you have for me that you feel may help to springboard into that specific learning? What do you require on a personal level to become liberated to effectively work with BIPOC-D job seekers? And what challenges might you face in establishing a relationship with a person who identifies as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color living with a disability that is seeking employment? So those are my questions for you. And I will ask that we go, Shafat, if you can go into the chat.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Winnie. We will open the Q&A session now. Marseille had a question in the chat about the mention of real practical tools. There was a mention of that in the video on managing diversity in the workplace. So she would like to know more about that.
All right, so when we talk about real practical tools, we're talking about tools that are intentional. Or at least when I hear real practical tools, I'm talking about tools that are intentional. Intentional so that we're not just ticking a box to say that we're engaging in diverse work. We're talking about tools that support the overall longevity and to disrupt. And so that may be different for different organizations depending on where you're at. So one of the tools that I sort of suggested was a strategic plan. And from that strategic plan, you're able to identify within your organization what's working well, what needs to continue to be augmented. The strategic tool can also, you can do a SWOT analysis, and you can also look at where are not just the gaps, but as an example, today we are doing this presentation on BIPOC, so persons who are Black, Indigenous, or a person of color living with a disability. And so, recognizing that separation of that population against other individuals who are living with a disability really sets up a dynamic. And we need to be able to say, why is it that we're doing this separately? Why is it that, and we know what the need is, but the reality is that we're looking at a particular population because of systemic racism. And so in addition to systemic racism, there are other intersecting identities that this population encounter. And so how do we eradicate that? And so hopefully a strategic plan with with the intention of disrupting a racist structure within the organization and calling, the organization calling themselves into question will help to create not only increased diversity, inclusion, but a sense of belonging for everybody.
Thank you, Winnie. We don't have any other questions at this point, but we just received one from Lisa. Lisa says, to address your first question, I think that as part of connecting and understanding the intersectionality of BIPOC-D, it helps to understand how systemic racism impacts BIPOC in terms of social determinants of health, such as housing, jobs, food security, etc. When there are gaps in these resources, groups are more susceptible to developing disability, trauma, poor health, care, chronic stress.
Yes, and I agree with Lisa in that when we're talking about, if we're talking about racism without the other forms of oppression, so without the other identities, definitely there is the impact on the social determinants of health. So in all of those sectors, and we talked about the many institutions where the impact is very real, but as well as we know that the psychological impact of racism in and of itself has lots of physiological complications on individuals' lives, racialized individuals' lives, as well as of social and mental well-being. So thank you for that, Lisa. It also, if I can just add, it also, when we're looking at from an organizational perspective, we want to make sure that we are not participating in what we called, and we discussed this last week, around the Olympics of oppression. We want to make sure that we are not setting different community members up against each other, even within our organization. And so we need to be conscious about that, and we need to be conscious about our own internal biases. And so individually, we have biases, but even as an organization, as the organization functions and operates, and the practice that it actually puts into place, how it develops its policies, we want to make sure that we have those, we want to have the input at the table that is addressing all of those issues as well, so that we're not seeing that competitiveness between the population that we are, that you're serving. The other is that we want to make sure that funding sources that we are, or that is supporting the organization, is also not forcing us to be in this competitive Olympics as well, so that we only support certain segments of the community. And so, again, it's important for organizations to be the champions through their understanding of the work that needs to happen, and to be able to share that with the funding sources as they're developing proposals and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Winnie. Sahana has shared that I have found that an equity audit within the service provider organization is helpful for folks to begin this journey. An equity audit that has an anti-racist lens seems more useful than one without.
Definitely. And I think because we're calling into question, how are we functioning? Are we perpetuating racist ideology? And do we understand what that is, right? So from an organizational perspective, if we are there to support employers, are we getting caught up in the mission or the expectation or the deliverables of our funding source? And so when I say, are we being held accountable so that we have to demonstrate that we were able to secure X amount of jobs for job seekers, and that is the deliverable, opposed to the holistic approach that we want to be able to provide for the individual. Because if we are finding ourselves meeting quotas, then we're really, as much as from an organizational perspective, we are trying to not operate under racist ideologies, but we're being forced to do so through the deliverables that we are being required to do based on our funding sources.
Thanks, Winnie. Lisa shares that competitive Olympics is ingrained in disability services, needs-based support, high-low functioning language.
Absolutely. And I think when we look at employability, when we look at the intentionality, when we look at the extras that we might need to do based on varying degrees or multiple types of disability an individual may have, it's important that we don't get caught up in saying, okay, let's work with this one, we'll work with this one, this person later. And we start to categorize people around ease opposed to seeing them as individuals. And so part of that tends to or could be as a result of the quotas or the deliverables that we're being challenged to adhere to in our policies.
Quotas and outcomes is the basis by most, if not all, funders, and it takes away from the realities of folks accessing services and their needs. That makes it very hard as a service provider to work on solutions that work for folks based on their lived reality.
Absolutely. And I think it really speaks to the work that doesn't get credited for. So within an organization, it takes time to establish trusting relationships. And especially if you have, if you have BIPOC folks coming into an organization where they're not represented, it takes even longer to build that trusting relationship because again, those individuals would have experienced multitude of oppression within other organizations. And so that time that's needed to develop that relationship, and even the question that I posed in terms of what does it mean to develop that relationship? What do you need to do to develop that relationship? And so you're right, it doesn't allow the time to do the front end work to establish that relationship. There was a question I saw that talked about a tool. And, I think part of the development of this and the title, the how or the why in front, if we understand why we are doing this work, we will establish our own tool. And so to have an equity tool really means deconstructing your organization, understanding what equity is, understanding the multiple impacts of this population are exposed to, and being able to construct your organization or even talk among other organizations so that you can come together to collaboratively work from an anti-racist equity tool and develop that tool for yourself. So the same tool is not going to work for organization A with organization B. What we need, though, is the individuals inside of those organizations to be committed to doing this work, to being committed to having an understanding, to being committed to challenging themselves, and being committed to do the work that is required to meet the needs of this population.
Thanks for sharing that, Winnie. We don't have any other questions in the chat box at this moment. So I think we can conclude our session here. Thank you so much, Winnie, for your time today. And thank you so much, everyone, for dialing in and listening to this webinar. Have a great day and goodbye.